Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CCA's webinar on Canada's regional standing post the Security Council loss. My name is Marta Blackwell, and I'm Vice President of the Canadian Council for the Americas. For those who don't know us, the CCA is Canada's premier forum for discussion of the critical political and economic issues in the hemisphere. Since March, we've actually hosted over 13 events on the COVID-19 pandemic across the region, specifically discussing the public health and economic impacts. We invite you to visit our website at ccacanada.com to see those and other CCA initiatives, including an event that we're hosting this Thursday at 2 p.m. on the post-COVID shift in global supply chains and where does Latin America fit. We also have 3 or 4 other events that we'll be hosting in the next few weeks, so please do keep an eye for those. You can also listen into CCA's podcast entitled Two Gringos with Questions. It's co-hosted by our president, Ken Frankel, and Chris Sabatini from Chatham House in London, and produced in conjunction with Global Americans based out of New York and DC. Some of the recent interviewees include Francis Fukuyama, former New Zealand President Helen Clark, as well as Daniel Coronel, the president of Univision News. The podcast is available on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Spotify. So before introducing the speakers, we'd like to give a special thank you to CCA's annual premium members. And now we'll get to today's event. So we're very pleased to host this discussion on Canada's standing in the region. It's an honor to introduce our esteemed panelists. To start, we have Jessica Byron-Reid, Professor and Director at the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. We have María Mejia, ex-Foreign Minister and ex-Ambassador to the UN for Colombia. Heraldo Muñoz, who we welcome back with us again. We've hosted him several times here in Toronto, and it's a pleasure to have him with us again. He was ex-foreign minister and ex-ambassador to the UN for Chile. So, and our esteemed Guillermo Rishchynski, ex-ambassador to the UN, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, among a bunch of other postings for the government of Canada, as well as a CCA board member. So with that, I will now hand it over to your moderator, Kenneth Frankel, the president of the CCA. Just one last thing before I go. If you would like to send questions, we do invite you to write in the Q&A box. We will do what we can to get to those, but time permitting. So thanks again, and thanks for being with us. Ken, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you all to the panelists for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Today's conversation is part of a broad conversation that has been percolating in Canada for a while about the fundamental principles, priorities, interests, and limits of Canadian foreign policy. The larger conversation is how and where can Canada, a G7 country, but only a middle power, defend its interests and effectively promote what Canadians lovingly call Canadian values? And how can Canada do this in a world dominated by 2 hegemons, one illiberal and the other its most important economic and political relationship, straining the retaining walls of liberal democracy? At the Canadian Council, we have long advocated that Latin America and the Caribbean provide Canada with the best, though not the only, opportunity to contribute constructively and significantly on a broad range of 21st century issues that are important to Canada, the hemisphere, and the world. Until now, these conversations have generally been limited to the parlors of foreign policy devotees and diplomats in Canada. The conversation now seems to be moving more mainstream in light of Canada's unsuccessful bid last week for a seat on the UN Security Council. That was Canada's second unsuccessful bid in a row after losing its first unsuccessful bid after losing 2010, its second unsuccessful in a row. As everyone listening likely knows, Canada came in third of 3 candidates for 2 vacant seats. The voting was Norway 130 votes, Ireland 128 votes, and Canada 108 votes. Of course, elections like these are not scientific barometers of sentiment in the world or even in the hemisphere. There are many factors that affect the outcome, including the length and quality of a country's campaign and the often parochial quid pro quo of vote bartering. Canada joined the race late. Norway and Ireland had already declared their runs long before Prime Minister Trudeau was elected, and Norway even before Mr. Trudeau's predecessor, Stephen Harper, was first elected Prime Minister. And because the ballots are secret, we don't know how some countries actually voted. However, we do know which countries declared that they wouldn't vote for Canada, and there is a general sense of which were sitting on the fence or may not have voted for Canada. But for all these qualifiers about not necessarily viewing the votes as indicative of the region's or a country's view of Canada, this process did surface useful information and feedback that is useful for Canada and the region. Today's conversation is about bringing into public view that information and feedback. For Canada, this exercise requires abandoning what Spaniards might call espejismo, which is looking in the mirror and seeing only what you want to see. On the other hand, for the hemisphere, it's also about having reasonable expectations of what a country like Canada of 35 million people can realistically accomplish in the region and in the hemisphere. So with those with those preliminary comments, I was going to call my own comments interesting, I'd like first to go to Gil and to talk a little bit about why Canada went for this seat, why it's important for Canada's view, worldview of multilateralism, and a little bit about the relative merits of the three countries in their discussions for the seat. Gil, if you would help us. Gil, you may have to unmute.
I did. I've been muted by the whole. Okay, very good. Now I've been unmuted. Be careful now. Thanks, everyone. Muy buenos días a todas. Bon dia, bonjour. I think I can honestly say that a week after the vote for the Security Council, here in Canada, we're dusting ourselves off. We've been to the hospital. We've had a CAT scan, and now we're going to go through a long period of physical examination to try to figure out not just what went wrong, but what we need to do differently in the future. We knew we were in a very competitive race with Norway and the Irish. I think what surprised people, certainly me, was how far we trailed behind. 20 votes behind the Irish, 22 behind the Norwegians. I did not expect that. I expected a first ballot in which all three countries would be basically within 10, 11 votes of each other. And the fact that we were so far behind leads me to think that we suffered a lot for having gotten into this race so late. As you rightly pointed out, Ken, Ireland declared for this seat in 2005, Norway in 2007. That means they had well over a decade of interaction with governments, with missions in New York, the famous vote swaps to make commitments back and forth. And Canada only entered in 2015 and was playing catch up from the outset. And why did we decide to go for this seat? I think the Prime Minister was determined to get us back on a positive footing into the international arena after a decade or more of minority governments, which constricted Canada's ability to act internationally, and a preceding government which basically made no bones about the fact that it had very little use for multilateralism. And so I think the Trudeau government wanted to say that we're back, and I think this was met with some applause in Canada. But I think the lesson of that mantra is that it's not enough to say that you're back. You have to show that you are back with concrete actions. And I think the last 4 years left something wanting from the point of view of people's perception of the difference between rhetorical support for multilateralism and actually raising your game. We should say we ran against two very, very good, very positive and powerful competitors. The Norwegians, as you know, probably give more development assistance proportionally than any country in the world. Over 1% of their GDP is dedicated to development assistance thanks to their sovereign wealth fund. They are known as the world's mediators. They've mediated peace processes from the Oslo process for the Middle East, Sri Lanka, and Colombia on many occasions. And so they have a track record as a country and a participant in multilateralism that I would suggest is second to none. The Irish presented a different kind of competitor because they really positioned themselves, and I think extremely well, as a champion of small countries. And this goes a long way in the United Nations system, where you have a lot of small island states, a lot of small countries in Africa. And Ireland really pronounced themselves as the proponent and defender of those who are small and seek a voice around the Security Council table. And that worked extremely well. And on the humanitarian assistance level, for a small country, Ireland really does perform extraordinarily. I mean, in UN humanitarian assistance, Norway is number 5, Canada is number 7, but Ireland, with a very, very small population, is number 11, and Irish aid really makes humanitarian assistance the fundamental element, if you will, of their engagement abroad. So all of this to say is that while Canada came forward with what we thought here in this country was a positive candidacy, certainly there were views that in Canada that didn't believe that this was the right time, that we should have waited perhaps longer. But the Trudeau government was determined and they decided to go for it, and one has to applaud at least their willingness to compete. But I think we ran into a bit of a perfect storm of two very, very good candidates with a lot of commitments already in place. And we just didn't have enough gas in the tank, if you will, to be able in a 4-year period of time to really get to the place that we needed to ensure that we at least got to a second ballot. I think the great disappointment for the foreign policy professional community here in Canada is that we had, I think, a very strong second ballot strategy. A lot of countries had told us, including a few in this region, that they wouldn't vote for us in the first round because they made commitments and they were going to honor those commitments. So by not getting to a second round, we didn't really get to see if there was some possibility of growth in our vote harvest if we had been down to a one-on-one kind of competition with the Irish. So the fact that the Irish got in right on the number, the Norwegians above the number, makes that a moot point. And now here in Canada, we go through the wrenching, soul-searching process of deciding what do we want to be in the world, and how do we get this right? And more importantly, when do we want to present ourselves again for potential consideration? You're right, and as you said in the outset, Ken, Canada was elected 6 times consecutively every 10 years, which has been sort of our window for wanting to participate on the Security Council. Well, now we've taken it on the chin 2 times in a row. And I think it behooves us to do some introspection here in Canada, decide what it is we want to try to be seen as in the world. What do we want to make our calling cards? Are we spread too thin? All of these questions need to be asked. And I think Canadians and people in both government, civil society, the private sector will need to kind of do that soul searching before we announce again for the future. But I'm sure we will. And I expect that if we take the lessons on board, then we have every reasonable chance of being elected in the future. This is not, in my judgment, a repudiation of Canada in any way, shape, or form. It's just simply a very competitive race. You know, countries like Sweden, like Finland, like Australia have all lost Security Council elections, some on multiple levels. We happen to be in a bit of a bad place right now, but I'm sure that in the future we will return to that table and being a member of the international community in the best standing possible. So with that, I'll let the other panelists speak a bit about how they saw this.
Thank you very much, Gil. There is a lot in there. Hopefully this webinar won't be gut-wrenching. This will actually be a smooth way into the hard process and an initial salvo. I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to reflect a little bit on what Gil said before we go into specific kinds of issues. But let's start with one of the points that Gil raised, and also raised in my introductory comments. And Jessica, I mean, I'll start with you. The fact that Canada entered the race late and it didn't go to a second ballot, do you think at the end that this was a major factor, or are there other factors involved with why Canada didn't win this vote? I saw you nodding enthusiastically when Gil's point about Ireland being the voice of small countries. So maybe you could address that, and if you can make sure you are unmuted as well, Jessica. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I just want, first of all, to agree with Gil that I think entering the race late was a major factor for Canada. And I have heard that from a couple of people I've spoken with. I mean, late in the sense of not having started the campaigning 5 years earlier. Yes. Now, having said that, and no doubt Canada would have lost a couple of votes, not a large number, but a couple of votes from, well, I can speak for the Caribbean region. Canada may not have gotten unanimous support from the Caribbean, but it certainly would have gotten a majority of Caribbean votes. Now, even if you got a unanimity from GRULAC, that's only about 32 votes. And I think that the hardest track for Canada to follow was really outside of the Americas. And it seems that Canada may have had more of an uphill battle with the Middle East and maybe Africa, probably some countries in Asia, in terms of garnering all the support that it needed. I'm not sure, but it seems to me that one would have to look there in terms of constructing a stronger majority another time round. I do think Ireland used the small state diplomacy very well. And it's an obvious, Ireland would have had two cards to play. One, the EU, it would have gotten the support of its EU fellow member states, and also the small state card.
Thank you, Jessica. María, what are your thoughts about this?
Thank you very much for this very constructive and very timely debate about what happens, because it's usually difficult for the losing country on such an important battle to have a debate so soon with las heridas abiertas, still, as Gil was saying. So thank you for that. I welcome it. I think it had a lot to do with the timing. I see it because a country like Colombia had commitments well before. I mean, we had like almost a decade commitment with Norway and with Ireland. So I think I coincide with Jessica that the region had already like a commitment with two very important countries, a small country, very similar to many of our Caribbean members in GRULAC, and secondly, Norway, a country that has been so committed to reaching peace in the region. I think for us as a region, it was important, I say it in the case of Colombia. I think also it is difficult to be in a group like a Western European and others. I mean, it's the position of Canada, not being in the hemisphere, of course, not being in the GRULAC, makes it difficult. And it was almost impossible. I see it as almost impossible to win this race. I don't think it is because of its foreign policy. I see a lot of debate in the media in Canada and in sort of think tanks and academics that they believe that it was a wrong campaign or a very expensive campaign that didn't give results. Campaigns are expensive and very difficult. And I think Norway has a track and a record, and Ireland does too. Ireland did an extraordinary campaign. I think Gil can say it, all of us that were there at the UN can say that they did an extraordinary campaign. So I think what surprised me as well is not having the possibility to go on a second round. I agree that it would have been an important opportunity, and maybe countries that were committed would have had the possibility to join or to support Canada on a second round. So I think numbers are like that. The Security Council is the most important body still today. And I think not reaching that possibility shows that the work done unfortunately didn't succeed, particularly in the Middle East and in Africa, I would say.
Thank you, Maria Emma. Heraldo, thank you for waiting patiently. It's your turn. You have to make sure you unmute. You may be muted. There you go.
Right. Thank you, Ken, and thanks to all my panelist friends, some of you from a long time. Well, this reflection on Canada's laws makes one wonder, perhaps, to turn the question on the side and to say, why did Norway and Ireland won rather than why Canada lost? Because Canada, in the first place, is a very important partner for Latin America and the Caribbean, for democracy promotion, for human rights, for trade, for investment, for so many other issues. So it's not that Canada had a faulty candidacy. On the contrary, this was a very tight race. And that, I think, should lead us to ask ourselves, why then did Norway and Ireland won? And the first thing is that entering the race late is a major factor because votes begin to be exchanged or bartered very early in the game. So if Norway had begun in 2005, 2006, and so did Ireland, this was an enormous advantage. So if the race is going to be tight, entering late is really entering with a great disadvantage. And votes begin to be exchanged, oftentimes without any relation to political affinity, for example. So that it is not enough to be progressive, because oftentimes progressive governments will exchange votes with conservative governments because they have other things to give to each other. So I think entering the game late, a major disadvantage, and a good explanation of why Norway and Ireland had an advantage. Second issue that I think is important. Both Ireland and Norway, one can assume they had a basket of European votes, more or less aligned, because among those three choices, evidently the Europeans, one could say, would lean more towards their European partners. Third, since they are also progressive governments, they had a very strong presence at the UN and in UN activities, from peacekeeping to development assistance. Thus, they had a very significant way of presenting themselves to the international community. With very strong support from some key areas. And in some cases, as Maria Emma has said, in the case of Norway, with a major presence in any significant peace talk that there may be anywhere in the world, but specifically in recent years in Colombia, with the negotiations with the FARC, where I know very well, because I led the participation of Chile when I was foreign minister as one of the countries that was involved in that, but perhaps the leading country in those talks that took place in Cuba was Norway. So that I think was a very significant factor in favor of Norway. So those are some of the elements that occurred to me of why Norway and Ireland had an advantage. So entering the race late, it's a major disadvantage unless you are China or the United States. If you are the US or China, you can, I mean, you don't need, because you're in the Security Council, you know, as permanent member. But, you know, for any other race that didn't have a permanent seat like China or the United States, yeah, if you are China or, you know, and you run for a post in any international organization where your post is assured or not assured, unlike the Security Council, then you can do that. But for any other country, it is a very difficult task when you have other very competitive actors. And two other reflections before to finish on this first round. I think it is a mistake to view Latin America as a unit. Latin America is very diverse, so you're never going to get a block of Latin American Caribbean votes, never. I mean, that would be very unlikely to occur. And it's not enough to speak to Mexico and to think that if you're going to speak to Mexico, you're going to get a number of votes. Not even a small country will take the lead from another larger country in the region, and we all know that. Even the CARICOM votes, generally they moved as a bloc. That hasn't happened for quite a while. And those votes have been divided, and it's very seldom that now the CARICOM will take a decision where they will vote as a bloc. Generally, that doesn't happen anymore. And in the end, Canada has had a very significant role with regard to the promotion of democracy in Venezuela. But that is not enough of an advantage, even with members of the Lima group, for example. Because on issues like voting, there are commitments that are made for other reasons or because they're done earlier. In the case of Chile, there was another situation where we presented 3 candidates for 2 posts that were, the 3 of them friends of Chile, progressive countries. And we were in a situation where my president was called by the president of this country, I will not reveal it, to ask for a vote. And we had committed our votes because we had been asked earlier by the other countries, and we had exchanged votes for something, I can't remember. And we have to say, Chile will honor its word, you know, even though the vote is secret, we already committed. So what we did was precisely what happened in a Canadian situation. We said, we are committed for the first round, but we will vote for you, that we can vote on the first round on a second round. And that is something that happens sometimes, even though my president would say, but how come we're not going to vote for this country, which is such a good friend of us? I said, Madam President, we committed and we have to honor our word. And that, I think, is part of what happens in this case with Canada entering too late in the game with 2 countries that had the same good credentials that Canada has.
Can I add?
Please.
If I may. Maybe it's an anecdote that Gil may have very clear. I remember that 2015, I believe it was the first visit outside Canada of Prime Minister Trudeau. When he came, we were in the big hall. It was, an enormous success, an enormous event when Mr. Trudeau came into the United Nations. And it was this mixed feeling. On the one hand, the happiness of many nations to get back, let's say, a strong presence of Canada at this multilateral scenario. But it was also his announcement that surprised many of his announcement of Canada's intention to get a seat in as a non-permanent member in 2020. So it was like, it was very brave because Canada had to do it. I don't know about timing. When Gil mentioned, was it the debate on the timing? I think it was fresh when Canada announced that it had to come in. Waiting another term would have been difficult for Canada. And this was an opportunity, even though it had two very strong and timing entering late to the race. But I think it was a very moving moment because it was this feeling of returning, but at the same time entering into a very difficult race.
Thank you, María. Our panelists are putting me in the position of being el abogado del diablo, abogado del diablo, o sea, the devil's advocate. So let me just mention a number of items that were raised publicly and then in privately conversations that we've had with diplomats throughout the hemisphere as issues that may have influenced their government or certainly have been considered when viewing Canada these days. And these are not necessarily complementary. So I'd like to go through this list and find out what your views are as to how Canada is performing in this role, whether these are legitimate criticisms, either vis-a-vis the UN vote or otherwise that Canada needs to be thinking about in this post-mortem process that Gil was talking about in his opening comments. And some of these criticisms are that Canada's contribution to overseas development assistance is lagging, the amount of peacekeepers, an exercise that Canada essentially invented, that the number of Canadian peacekeepers in the field in the world are lagging, and certainly not what they are for others, certainly not what they are for Ireland, for example. And then in specific hemispheric issues, Heraldo mentioned Venezuela and Canada's role in the Lima Group. There have been other criticisms that Canada took itself out of being a fair broker in Venezuela, precisely the role that Norway has played, that actually should have been a Canadian role. I'm not giving value opinions one way or another. I'm just surfacing some of these criticisms of the way that Canada handled the election of the Secretary General of the OAS this time around, the amount of foreign aid, not enough presence in the non-Pacific Alliance countries, is to say Mercosur, that it's become a little bit too closely identified with US policy. And I've heard that a few times with respect to Venezuela. Again, I recite those without any judgment one way or the other, but I'd be interested in knowing from the panelists what they think about any or all of those items that I've listed. Maybe Jessica, I'll start with you, but I definitely want all the panelists to have a go at this one. Jessica?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Ken, let me try to start. Now, on the question of development cooperation, here I'm going to speak very much from a Caribbean perspective. And I think generally, Canada remains a very valuable development partner for Caribbean countries, both in terms of development assistance and in terms of advocacy. Excuse me, Canada stands out for its support for institution building in terms of the CARICOM countries. It's been a very strong partner of the Caribbean Development Bank, for example, very strong and very consistent. It's been an equally strong, it's channeled its funds into, up to recently, PAHO, and into building up, supporting health systems in a number of Caribbean and Central American countries as a COVID response. It has for a long time been a major contributor to education and capacity building in the Caribbean. And it's also focused quite a lot of its development funding on leadership programs, youth leadership development programs, which is also regarded as significant. And probably one of its most consistent areas of contribution have been to disaster response, disaster preparedness, and disaster response management. It has worked very much with SIDEMA, the Disaster and Emergency Management Agency in the Caribbean. And it has a major program on resilience building for small, vulnerable countries. And finally, Canada has, in terms of advocacy, in addition to, of course, Canada speaks for the Caribbean in the IMF, but in addition to that, it has supported Caribbean calls for shifting this argument that middle-income countries shouldn't have access to concessionary funding. Canada has in recent times been a strong supporter of the argument that vulnerability and resilience considerations should be a part of deciding on eligibility for climate change funding in particular. And I think up to recently, President Trudeau co-chaired a UN Development Finance meeting with Prime Minister Holness of Jamaica, speaking about this issue. Now, all of those are seen as, quite apart from Canada's economic weight in the Caribbean, it's still a very important investment and tourism. And, you know, it's an important economic partner, not just in CARICOM, but for Cuba, for the Dominican Republic, for many countries. So I don't think there's any question about Canada's contribution in terms of development cooperation across the board. I think, though, that there has been much less visibility for Canada up until recently. In the 1990s, there would be regular, every 5 years, meetings with Canadian executive leadership and the Caribbean. Those were abandoned at some point. And it is only very recently, in fact, leading up to the Security Council vote, that Canada has restarted meetings with the foreign ministers, meetings with senior foreign affairs officials, and they've started some very important dialogues, regular dialogues, that we hope will continue. I think, in a broader sense, I think everybody would feel that the Canadians lost their appetite for taking an active role in peacekeeping over the last few years. I think the last time Canada was engaged in a peacekeeping mission, it would have been in Mali a couple of years back, and Canada pulled out within a year. So we've seen Canada's multilateral role changing over the years. Now, those changes are probably in response to internal pressures and probably in response to experiences, difficult experiences in the 21st century precisely in the area of peacekeeping. But in terms of Canada's profile as a development partner, as one of the most supportive middle powers, I think Canada's role is still perceived very positively, even though it is also felt that Canada is in a difficult situation these days with a shifting global order, and Canada is sort of squeezed between the United States and China, and the Canadian voice has been more stifled. And maybe Canada needs to be clearer as to what its voice is. I think there would be that view also.
That's a perfect finishing statement for that discussion about Canada trying to find its voice and to make it clear to the world. Thank you, Jessica. Maria, what's Canada doing right, and what can Canada do much better at?
Well, I think in terms of our region, Canada is in a difficult position, let's say, not because it's their fault, it's because, as Heraldo was saying, our agenda is a difficult agenda now. We're very much divided. I mean, we haven't been able, for example, we have almost a veto in every decision because of the situation with Venezuela that has divided us even more. So being in the Lima group already sets a tone, and being what it is at the OAS gives an agenda that is not the most positive agenda. I think it is a country that has gained a lot of importance economically. The investment, for example, in Colombia is one of the largest investors in Colombia in the last 2 decades, or particularly the last decade. We have trade agreements with the region, which is a positive factor. I think Heraldo may say it better because he's been present in the Pacific Alliance, but it plays an important role in the Pacific Alliance. That is, it goes to that trade element. What I see lacking is for peace and security, which is the main objective of the Security Council. I think it has difficult positions, seen particularly Middle East, Israel, support, and the difficulties or the strains with the United States relations. So I think I had to end in a note that Jessica mentioned, probably to define itself, because we have seen it changing and shifting in Colombia from a country that was very much receiving Colombians' migration, helping in the peace process, more in the human rights process than in the peace process. So I think it has to see itself and see how it defines a position to be able to continue contributing in the world, and hopefully the peace and security elements is where I think it lacks a presence that may have hurt him or add to the late arrival and didn't allow him for a second round of votes that we all expected he was going to do.
Maria, I just want to go to Heraldo, but just to follow up on your question, do you think that Canada's role in Venezuela has generally been seen as positive role? Obviously, the Colombian government now would be very supportive of what Canada's role has been, but the Canada's role is sort of interesting because on one side, I've heard people say, well, it's too close to the United States policy on Venezuela. And on the other side, they say, well, actually, no, Canada's been very constructive in the Lima group, being a moderating force on some governments in the Lima group that wanted to be way more aggressive than Canada would have wanted to, and sort of acted that way. Do you have a sense about how Canada's role balancing those two dynamics on Venezuela has worked to Canada's advantage or disadvantage?
I would say that it has played an important role. I think it has been constructive, and I think it has been important, and it has gained leadership. But of course, in such a polarized region in which we are divided totally, it creates that difficulty because the Lima group is sort of trying to reinvent itself and to continue in its dynamic. The United States has its own dynamic towards Venezuela. We have seen it this weekend, and with Mr. Bolton's book, it would be even heated the discussion. But I think Canada has played a role, an important role, and it has to help now in this reinvention, let's say, or in this model of the Lima Group. Where are we going to go with the Lima Group and to be productive? And Canada can play a role.
Thank you, Maria. Heraldo, once again, I thank you for being patient, but There's a lot here for you to talk about, Heraldo. The floor is yours. I think you're on mute, Heraldo.
Yeah, I think it was a good decision for Canada to be part of the Lima Group because as you recall, the Lima Group was never confrontational against Venezuela. What it posed was a democratic and a peaceful outcome to the crisis in Venezuela, and it sought dialogue. It was only when the Venezuelan regime did not respond that the Lima Group began promoting sanctions or promoting limiting relations with the Venezuelan regime. So the effort was for the region to propose an alternative, a peaceful outcome to the deep crisis of Venezuela. So I thought it was a good idea. And indeed, I think Canada played a moderating role along with my own country and others within the Lima Group so as to be proactive and looking for an outcome instead of just simply posing an attitude of obstruction to any democratic outcome. On the contrary, what was sought was precisely a peaceful democratic outcome to the deep crisis in Venezuela. So I would put Canada on the right side by being part of the Lima Group. Now there's a larger question about the relationship between Canada and the Latin American Caribbean region, and that is that if Canada wants a little bit more influence, it has to play a larger political role, independent role in the region, and that is enough separate from that of the US so that it's not seen as too close to the US policy. And that in a way, it may be a balancing role to that of the US, particularly under the present conditions with Trump in the White House. But the point is larger than that. And that is, what type of relationship should there be between the region and Canada? Sometimes from the perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean, we see Canada like too far, not geographically, but too far in terms of being involved in the region beyond issues of trade, investment, and supporting human rights. When the question is posed, because it's something that had been posed by you at the beginning, Ken, well, should in the future maybe Canada compete not in the WEOG, where it's really difficult, but in GRULAC? The response I would say is that's not a good option, because you cannot simply compete in order to gain a bid from Latin America and the Caribbean, and in practice, all of your efforts are elsewhere. And it's understandable, because Canada is a member of the G7, it's a member of the G20, it has a relationship with Europe that is different from that of Latin America. It has a relationship with the United States that is unavoidable, so that there's not enough time, perhaps, there's not enough resources to dedicate to Latin America and the Caribbean, so one can understand, because Canada is a global actor. But you cannot do that, continue to be a global actor, and then say, well, but I'm going to compete from a seat from GRULAC. I think that would lead to an attitude of more distancing with regard to Latin America and the Caribbean, rather than, well, this is the way that we should go in the future. So Canada has to decide what type of relationship it wants to have with Latin America and the Caribbean. If it wants to have a larger relationship, it has to dedicate more resources and, more importantly, more time. Because oftentimes, Prime Minister Trudeau was invited to come to Latin America. There was never any time. When you don't have time to do that, then that means that you're not a priority. And it's understandable, because, again, Canada has plays on various fields in the global arena. So it cannot simply, well, I'm not going to dedicate a lot of time to Latin America and the Caribbean. And I see with a little bit of preoccupation that even Canada has lost some ground in the Caribbean, where it always has had a very large footing, and maybe it continues to do so. But if it wants to go beyond the Anglophone Caribbean, then you have to dedicate more resources, more time, and more political initiative. And that is something that I think is a decision that the leadership in Canada has to weigh against the other priorities that Canada has in its foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Heraldo. I'm in 1 second, I'm going to go to Gil and ask him for his impressions of what everybody has said. So that's a very modest task I'll be assigning Gil in a second or two. I just want to go touch on something that Maria Emma had mentioned a second ago. And it's maybe a brief answer for each of you. But Maria Emma talked about the size of Canadian investment and business in Colombia. And it's something obviously at the council that we're very close with, as it is in all of the countries. Heraldo, you know, we've done those kinds of events with you in Toronto as well. So the question is a very simple question. How much weight does it have in a country's regard for Canada based on how much economic engagement it has in that country? How important a factor is that when the country is considering voting for Canada in a quorum, or it's considering weighting the importance of a relationship, however you may do that in various initiatives? Heraldo, I'm going to go to you first because I've been going to you last. How important is the economic involvement of Canada or any country in Chile? How determinative is that of how the government takes that into, weighs that when making multilateral votes and other initiatives?
Well, I think it is significant, but it's not decisive because you may have a significant investment by many countries, and that's all well and good. And I think it's very significant, in fact, because it begins to construct links that are important in our bilateral relationship. So I would say, yes, it is important. But when deciding a vote, there are other factors that go into the formula. There's a political affinity for sure, but beyond political affinity, as I said before, if there are specific interests that a country has with regard to another post, and you want to exchange votes, there may be political differences, and you're going to get an agreement anyhow. And they are, well, the role of timing when you go into with your candidacy plays a very significant role. But I would say investment, trade are very significant. And sometimes you begin constructing a relationship that go beyond trade when you have affinity. I'll give you an example. When we signed the TPP-11 without the United States, when we decided, I took a big chance as foreign minister of Chile, and I asked my colleagues, ministers of trade and foreign relations, whether they would come to Viña del Mar to discuss the possibility of going ahead with the TPP without the United States after Trump had withdrawn. And it was very risky because I was inviting the ministers and maybe they weren't going to come. And they all came. In fact, Japan sent 2 ministers, not just one. And I remember that we had a very good talk, and Canada was very enthusiastic about it. So was Australia, and others were doubtful, but in the end, we pushed ahead. And we actually signed, renegotiated the agreement, and we signed a treaty without the United States. And what did we do at the time of signing? We signed a protocol with Canada and New Zealand, and Chile, which was to emphasize the progressive part of the agreement. that we were going to, every 3 years, I think, we were going to look into the agreement, whether it was complying with environmental, labor rights, with the gender component of the agreement, with the progressive and the resolution of conflicts part of the agreement, where we had some doubts. And that, I thought, that was a very significant signal, because beyond trade, these three countries were saying, you know, we care not only about trade, but we care about other values, about other issues. That was a good signal, in my view. That's the type of thing that I think Canada should think more of, going beyond simply trade and investment, because trade and investment is done by any countries. Middle Eastern countries come to Latin America now for opportunities of business. But if you don't go beyond business, then it's fine to have business ties. It is good, it's a good underpinning, but it has to go beyond that if you want to have political outcomes.
Thank you, Heraldo. You know, Maria, it would seem, based, you talk about Colombia's vote having been long committed, and certainly if the vote in Colombia were based on economic engagement, Canada would have been the #1 choice, the second and the third choice for Colombia, as opposed to the two countries apparently had voted for in the first round. Having said that, do you want to just talk 30, 60 seconds about how a government views the kind of relationship developed through economic engagement in calculating its overall relationship with a country and the importance of the country?
I think it is indeed very important. I agree with Heraldo. I think it plays an important role, particularly if there had been a second round. I think, to construct, because in Colombia, Canada has been in difficult times in Colombia with migrants, particularly, that had to go with asylum in Canada in our very tough moments. Now it's trade and investment. So I think it plays a role, particularly if we had gone, as we expected it, to a second round, that maybe the government would have been possibly saying, okay, in the second round, I may go for Canada. So I think it is important.
Thank you, Maria. Jessica, obviously the economies in the Caribbean are smaller by comparison than they are elsewhere in Latin America. But do you want to talk a little bit about that, please? You're on mute, Jessica. You're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, we all keep forgetting to unmute.
Now you're fine.
Yes, I think this particular type of vote, where the non-permanent seat on the Security Council, where campaigns start years in advance, that doesn't operate quite the same way as a lot of the other battering and haggling over support that goes on for other multilateral positions. And I think that for the average one, Canada's economic role, its importance in the Caribbean would be taken into account, because Canada has a very important role, even in these small economies. Traditionally, it's had a really key role in the banking and finance sector, in the hotel sector, and of course in the mining sector. Those have been Canada's three most prominent areas of economic activity. Things are changing. Most of the Canadian banks are repositioning themselves. They're adapting to global conditions. And so you find, if you take Scotiabank, Scotia has shifted within the Caribbean. Its largest investment is now in the Dominican Republic. And it is moving out of the Eastern Caribbean, very small markets. And I think it's taken a huge chunk of a bank in Chile. So you see shifts taking place, but Canada still remains a major investor in the region. Canada, and it's an important economic partner. It still is in these areas. Now, something that Heraldo Muñoz mentioned about the infusing positive values into economic cooperation. I think we value that in our relations with the Canadians. In both the development cooperation and other initiatives that Canada has taken, there's always been great regard to gender issues, to promoting gender equality and empowerment of women. There's always been great regard to human rights issues. And two important issues for us in recent years have been, first of all, the seasonal farm workers program, which is a huge program that started it's been going for over 50 years. And it is very important in the Caribbean labor markets and in, raising opportunities and economic possibilities for people who don't earn that much money in the agricultural sector. And I think there have been a lot of discussions between Canada and Caribbean governments about also providing opportunities for education and for the learning of new agricultural techniques and skills while these workers are engaged in these 6-month rotations in Canada. So you're seeing there as well the possibility to introduce progressive values into that. I wanted finally to mention the importance of our diasporas. The Canadian diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora in Canada is an important one. It is often drawn from the most educated sectors of the community. And Caribbean governments have become very interested in recent years in engaging much more with their diasporas and with working on joint development programs and so on. And I think that is an important aspect of our socio-economic relationship with Canada. And there is a lot of potential for strengthening those links in the future. I just wanted to say, I think we hope that Canada will remain a very engaged country in multilateralism. Multilateral organizations are facing a number of crises, and multilateral organizations are important for small countries such as ours. And we would like to join forces in strengthening the multilateral system and probably working out some new rules in various areas. And we see Canada as an important potential ally in that area. And also as a continued important partner in a number of sustainable development areas.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Well, Gil, you've listened to all of this after starting us off. It's easy to say, what are your overall comments? As part of that, I guess one of the questions I would have, excuse me, in the background, there's a vendor selling aguacates in Masamora. So excuse me for the María would understand the importance of Masamora in Medellin and aguacates. Gil, listening to this, in addition to general comments or specific as you want to be, what is the perception gap, you think, between what the hemisphere is telling Canada and what Canada thinks of its standing in the hemisphere?
No, Ken, that's I think a very, very appropriate point of departure. And as I listen to María, Jessica, and Heraldo talk about the issues that they consider in terms of their perceptions of Canada, my mind took me back to my abuelita from my childhood in Panama, who would tell me that people will judge you not about what you say, but what you do. And I think that is where Canada really has to focus its thinking. We've been very good at the declaratory aspects of expressing our values and our priorities, but it's about what we do physically that changes the landscape of how people perceive us. That really is where I think we have to focus in the future. You know, I think it was, we started the discussion about development cooperation. You know, by any measure, we are falling short. I mean, the Norwegians and the Irish use this to very great effect because they are increasing their development cooperation as a proportion of their GDP. And in Canada, we're going in the other direction. And if that weren't enough, we have sent some very confusing signals to our development partners around the world by having numerous country of focuses exercised, where a country for 5 years is a country of focus, then it falls off and isn't a country of focus anymore. These things have consequences. And if the amount of dollars that you're putting into bilateral development cooperation are actually going down, well, then people are going to see that for what it is, that there is either less interest or other priorities, and it impacts on them and at times offends their amor propre. And that's something that we have to be sensitive to. For a long time in the Caribbean, we wanted to only do regional programming and to the exclusion of bilateral programming. Well, if you're a small country or a small island with 40,000 people, yeah, you're part of a region, but you want to be taken seriously on your own measure in terms of a country like Canada being interested in bilateral dialogue. And there, I think we have fallen short over the course of the last 20, 25 years. You know, peacekeeping was raised. I mean, Norway, Ireland, and Canada, no one has, from the developed world, large peacekeeping forces deployed other than some of the P5 members due to longstanding historical linkages. But the issue with peacekeeping is that you have to be consistent in terms of raising your hand and standing up and saying that you're prepared to participate. And for a long time, since the Balkans in the 90s, you know, until Mali, very recently, Canada really didn't raise its hand and say we were willing, other than policing in Haiti. And there, Canada played a very, very unique role through the RCMP as a contribution to the multinational force that the UN put forward with MINUSTA. And, you know, we need to make some, I think, judgments in terms of what we want to do. If sending our military is something that there is either less appetite for, or we don't feel that we're ideal for the kinds of missions that are being put together, then maybe we want to make policing the area of focus for Canada and put our eggs in that basket, if you will, in terms of a contribution to that. But, you know, for me, I always believe that part of Canada's recipe for success in the multilateral arena, and the reason that we were voted constantly onto major multilateral fora, was that all of that was underpinned by extremely strong and deep bilateral relationships. And here, I think, because of resource constraints, because of just the realities of prioritization, we have not perhaps given the kind of attention necessary to reinforcing the traditional bilateral relationships we have with countries on an individual basis. It's all well and good to be part of the Pacific Alliance. It's all well and good to be part of the OAS. But if you don't have inherent relationships with the individual member states of those organizations, it becomes very, very difficult to be taken seriously. And if the only time you see other countries at the highest political level is at summits, you know, as opposed through constant bilateral interaction by ministers, you know, vice ministers, and public servants, it becomes that much more difficult going forward. I think the colleagues raised some really interesting points about Canada's relationship with the United States. You know, for many years, we considered ourselves the ham in the nuclear sandwich during the Cold War, kind of where the missiles would fly over in either direction. Well, I think we're finding out that we're still the ham in the sandwich in terms of big power politics around the planet. Now with China and the United States particularly. But we have to have a pragmatic relationship about the US. But I think at a personal level, I can tell you, I think we've been squeamish about getting in the face from time to time of our great neighbor and saying, yeah, we hear you, but we don't agree with you. And I think there you have to take a stand that may have consequences, but you have to pick your spots very, very carefully in terms of what it is that you do. The debate about geographic group, you know, I mean, if Canada were to decide it didn't want to be part of Western European and other, and it's not a hard decision because there are only 4 other, and the rest are all Western European. So that tells you something right away. I don't think moving to GRULAC is the answer. Personally, I mean, I live this in New York. GRULAC really isn't keen on Canada joining. They don't see us as a fully committed partner in terms of what GRULAC represents. We are too different and too distinct, perhaps too Norteamericano, as one would say, but that's a reality. And the option might be then to look at sitting as an independent. That might have its downsides, but it's something that needs to be examined. But I think Heraldo's right that you know that GRULAC is not the magic elixir in terms of Canada being in a group where perhaps it's going to be different. And but at least GRULAC has a rotation scheme without contested elections for the Security Council, which the Western European and other group has found impossible to agree on because of the nature of European approaches to these types of things. I'd like to conclude just talking about the economic aspects of our relationship with the hemisphere. And the comments, I think, were spot on. You know, trade and investment are important, but there are a lot of important trade and investment linkages. It's what you do with those links in terms of making them a foundation for a more enhanced relationship with a country. And it's a double-edged sword because, you know, there is reputational risk. The behavior of Canadian entities in country X or country Y have an impact on how we are seen as a partner and as a country. And that's something that we need to bear in mind, that private investment is not done in the vacuum of the market. It is part of the larger context of a relationship between the companies and investors from Canada with the areas that they go. And we have to be extremely careful about our behavior. You know, I have, during the course of my diplomatic career, lived in places where, you know, there was a perception of the ugly Canadian. And that's something that we constantly need to bear in mind, that we will be judged on our actions and our behavior, whether it's of our corporates, whether it's of our political decisions, and all of this has consequences going forward. But I think as we here in Canada start looking at what we do from the point of view of recalibrating both our actions and our messaging in terms of how we want to play in the international arena, you know, I go back to something Maria said at the outset. I think Latin America and the Caribbean were with us, maybe not in unanimity by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we had the majority of support from this hemisphere in terms of the bedrock of our campaign. And I know that in 2010, when we lost and we went to actually 3 rounds of votings, in the 3rd round, the ones who stuck with us through thick and thin were our friends and partners in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is our core area of support. We have work to do in Africa, clearly, and their development assistance plays an overarching role, as does presence in peacekeeping. The Middle East and the volatilities of policy choices is something that you have to accept is going to be part of that reality. But I think as we position ourselves for what we want to try to do the next time we present in 2030 or later, I think the question we have to ask ourselves in Canada is, what will people see as the singular Canadian contribution that we are trying to make in the world? We are stretched so thin with very, very modest levels of resources, trying to be all things to all people, that I think we've reached a point of unsustainability. We have to decide what are the 2 or 3 things that Canada wants to make absolute priorities in terms of what people will see us as dedicated and committed to on the multilateral scene, and then put the resources necessary to really lift our games in those areas. Not to the exclusion of others. We can still have things to say, we can still have opinion, and we can still be contributors, but you have to really determine the 3 overarching things that when country X or country Y in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa or Asia ask themselves, what is Canada doing that is making a difference in my environment? They focus on those things and see them for what they are, that we've dedicated significant time, resources, energy, and our own humanity in terms of trying to make a contribution in that regard. And I think on that kind of basis, you know, we can be like Norway and Ireland were in 2020 if we present ourselves a decade from now for a potential Security Council seat. But I think you can't take anything for granted. Jessica is absolutely right. the Caribbean was taken for granted, perhaps is in certain cases by Canada. I think we're better now than we were 5 years ago in that respect, in terms of trying to recultivate those relationships. But this is an organic process. You have to constantly be looking at and figuring out how it is you want to strengthen relationships. What new inputs can be brought to bear to buttress the commitments that we have in terms of shared values and shared visions? What can we do that impacts positively on the daily lives of people in the region? And this is going to become particularly important in a post-COVID environment. We're looking at a recession that in Latin America over the course of the next decade is going to be deep and profound. A lot of people that rose out of poverty a decade ago are going to be falling back into poverty. This is an opportunity for us to calibrate our thinking and our actions going forward, to continue to be a constructive partner in the hemisphere and translate some of that into an extended view of trying to be a constructive partner to the world.
Thank you very much, Gil. We've abused the panelists' time by 17 minutes. We promised it would be an hour. It's a little bit more. The worst part about this is having to end it because there's so much still on the table to discuss, even for a first shot at it. This is not the first initiative in reimagining or trying to help contribute to the development of a solid and a comprehensive and a coherent Latin American foreign policy on behalf of the Canadian Council for the Americas. And so we really hope that all the panelists will stay engaged with us as we go forward in our other initiatives. Gil has to be, because he's a board member of the CCA, if for no other reason. So he's committed to this. But with that, thank you very much for all of your keen insight. Thank you for all the listeners. As Marta had mentioned earlier, this will shortly be posted on our website at some point today. And so feel free to listen and distribute however you want, and ccacanada.com. So with that, I will close the meeting and thank you very much, each and every one of you. Thank you.